Hello, everybody, and I welcome all of you back to another Chris Chan article from the Quickie. And I hope all of you are doing good. And well, honestly, okay, so I have to start this video with a little bit of a confession to you guys, and I hope that I keep this as I'm gonna try my best to keep this simple, but of lately I've not really been doing great. There's a lot of pressure currently surrounding me behind the scenes financially, and sometimes it really is like it feels as if like the pressure is either going to break me or it's either straight up just going to kill me. The only thing I can say, for those at all concerned, since I feel like I can't really hold it back, is that guess what? This will only get worse if I don't address it and I don't tackle it. From my experience so far in 2025, when people tell you that, you know, a problem shared is a problem halved, I kind of came away with the impression, based on quite a lot of reception that I received, that this was completely contrary to what actually happens in the real world, because from my experience of what happens in the real world, trying to share my problems has resulted in nothing but ridicule, disappointment, and a lot of finger pointing. And I'm not expecting people to solve my problems or anything like that. I want to be given a fair chance in this sort of thing. But despite all this, I don't. And one thing you're going, and this is probably going to be one of those instances where I actually feel I can understand a lot of perhaps where Chris is coming from. About why you sort of look upon nostalgia as a means of a coping mechanism. However, here's the big difference between how Chris uses nostalgia to cope and how I use it to cope. Chris, insofar as you and I are concerned, he uses nostalgia as a means only to be reminded of instances where he was happy, which is, you may say, call it for what you will, but quite a lot of people do that. I've done that many times before, and I have never once claimed to be better than Chris. But what I am saying is that in Chris's circumstances, it's easy to understand. The only difference, however, is that it would seem from the outside world that is all Chris uses the idea of nostalgia for. Whereas, and I've spoken about this very, very publicly before, there are times in my life, ladies and gentlemen, where I will go back in the Rolodex of my memory to remember if there were instances where I've been in very specific situations where I'm short on money. I feel as if like I have a secret that I have to tell people that I'm rather embarrassed about, and I got to work out exactly what I did, and I've got to sort of take it from there. So let's just go through this article, because there's probably a little bit more to it than that, at least from Chris's point of view. But in the meantime, let's go get into it. I really miss the good times of those days, reminiscing of high school. I mean, again, that's almost too real. And if we're also we're gonna be fair about this, you see this guy over here? That was a picture of me from 10 years ago when I was 17 years old. This is back when I felt actually I dressed very smart for sixth form. I had like I said, I had a really nice tie. I had a really, it was those 2 years I spent in sixth form was the only time I actually ever wore like a smart short sleeve blue shirt. And I'm not gonna lie, I miss wearing it. If for no other reason than it went with a black tie really well. Okay, so goodbye. Nostalgia is a sentimental longing or wistful affection for the past, typical for periods and or places with happy personal associations. It is associated with a yearning for the past, its personalities and events, particularly for the good old days or childhood events. The foundation of much of Chris's adult life has been his fixation on the past, especially for things that have had deep significance to his life, in order to escape from the present, whether it be through cartoons, interacting with past gal pals and sweethearts, or reminiscing past experiences with trolls. The only way I could sit, it's probably one of the few times that Chris actually would have interaction with people outside of his immediate circle. So, though whether or not Chris really does feel that sort of thing, like I genuinely misses the trolls, we'll have to wait and see about that. Nostalgia in Chris's life. Although viewed as a mental disorder, disease, I'm going to say disorder rather than disease, because I think mental disease is a bit of an outdated term, if you ask me. When it was first discovered, nostalgia in the modern age is seen as a natural, common, positive emotion for escaping the confines of reality. Seeing how difficult it is for Chris to grasp reality as it is in its present, the way he grasps the past is unimaginably worse. Chris's nostalgia comes from a wide variety of sources. It can be speculated that the main source of Chris's nostalgia is in unhealthy amounts is his stress. At a psychological level, nostalgia is the result of negative feelings and results in the increase in one's positive emotions. It can also be used as a coping mechanism for dealing with whatever stressful situation one may be in. Yeah, as we discussed earlier, given how Chris currently lives his life, constantly dealing with weans and being denied China by every girl he meets, Chris will sometimes use his past experiences in a strange way to relieve his stress. Now, I should also point out that this article is a little bit behind the times because, as of 2025, whilst Chris is on Blue Sky, although he does still occasionally post on X, I think maybe through more hardened restrictions, either through as of the terms and conditions of his arrest, or it might be possibly due to influences culminated by Flutter, but because there's so little information, and certainly Chris has never really exposited upon any of this, so whatever the truth may be will remain to be seen. Chris seems to be a little bit more calmer in the sense that he doesn't post in excess to what Chris used to do before Chris got arrested, if that makes sense. Now, with that being said, it does not necessarily mean Chris is necessarily completely under control of his own emotions, even at the age of 43, but what we can sort of deduce, even from this period, is that on the surface, because Chris has spent a lot of the last 12 months trying to organize his Quick Light store, and by any ordinary sense of the word, Chris seems to be quite devoted to the task at hand. With that being said, how much Chris does actually make, and whether or not Chris is 100% happy now that this arrangement is actually creating some level of revenue for Chris. There's a lot of things to suspect about whether or not Chris is legitimately happier now, or if there's any sort of, or maybe this is just having a bit more peace has sort of taken Chris out of the past a little bit. Maybe that's kind of what do you guys think? Do you think, talking about Chris post release, Chris is legitimately happier with where he is, or do you think that Chris is still probably sporadically out of control mentally, as Chris has always been? I'll be interested to hear what you guys think, because it's one of those things where you can argue one way or the other. Anyway, let's continue. Even after being accusing her, decided to okay, hang on. Let's see. For example, at the end of the Jessica saga, Chris, feeling awfully depressed from losing his girlfriend for the umpteenth time, decided to contact Megan on her Facebook and hook up with her again, even after having been accusing her of being behind his current situation for the past 4 years. Other times, Chris will hold on to past experiences that gave him grief. For example, before attempting to contact Megan ever again, Chris always held on to how Megan was somehow responsible for his problems in his life for supposedly leaking information of him on Encyclopedia Dramatica with Mims and Lucas. Now, you may be asking to yourself, guys, why Chris did not just straight up ask Megan, did you do this, yes or no? Why? I don't think it's ever been disclosed that Chris ever, because that would, you would be it would be understandable why that would be the very first thing somebody would ask. Because why Chris didn't just do that is something that maybe he's probably lived to regret. Not just doing things when it's probably the best thing to do. This attachment to such events can become so strong that eventually Chris will snap from all of the added stress. For example, in several 2013 September Facebook posts, Chris continuously curses Megan along with other fruits of his bad memories. I mean, to be fair, this was a period when Chris was particularly very low, but as it's been mentioned before, Chris was a grown man by that point, and this was even before the house fire, before Chris pepper sprayed somebody. There's things Chris could have done, and well, I think it was pretty much, well, why they call it the first exile, to say the least. Anemia, nostalgia for a time before Chris was born. As with many people, Chris also experiences nostalgia for media released before he was born. Much like a modern kid who loves 80s music will tell you how Queen is the best band on the planet, Chris has a liking for I Love Lucy, Gilligan's Island, and other media released during Bob and Bob's time. This is common for people who spend more time around their parents than they do around their peers. Well, I would also say it's more nostalgia for the things that they did actually watch, no matter what, regardless of when it came out or not. So, there is, of course, that as well. Chris and his childhood. When it comes to nostalgia, people tend to cherish it in order to relive a far simpler time. While this is perfectly normal in most people, Chris's obsession with his past takes this normal aspect of the human psyche and twists it to pathological degrees. Chris revels in his childhood memories and pursuing childlike fantasies to fill up the stressful parts of his life, purely to ignore them. After getting a bear hug at the 2018 MagFest from a fan who lifted his 212-pound plus body off the ground, Chris commented on the nostalgia he felt, saying, "Hey, did anyone get video or photo of at Spinal Palm hugging me and lifting me up high after the panel? I would love to have that video to watch over and over. I never thought I could ever be lifted up high by anyone since I got too heavy for my parents." I'm sure there's probably a lot more than that, but let's continue. I mean, there's also aspects of Chris's childhood that I know fine well Chris will go back to, like from being pinned down to the ground during the Faneuil Green Elementary School and the principal recording. Was it his principal that recorded his screams? Something like that? I'm not entirely sure. But you will also be noticing is that Chris also, in instances like this, Chris sort of reminisces on things that, well, he not only he does remember, but the things he wants to recall on. During Chris's time at Region 10, being told to recall memories of being at Nathaniel Green was something that Chris pretty much blamed his therapist on, saying that he never wanted to be reminded of that ever again. But then again, considering that we know that Chris is relatively hostile to the thoughts of therapy or anything like that, it's probably why Chris's response is to retreat further and call himself CPU Jesus Christ Chan Sonichu Blueheart or something. You know, that is a pretty good... Do you think it is literally just because it's just Chris did it out of spite towards therapists? Probably not. Manchester High. Of all the memories Chris holds dear, he seems to be most attached to his years in Manchester High School. It isn't too hard to see why. His years there were among the last where he frequently got out of his house and interacted in a social environment. This is best shown with the Green County Conspiracy video, the Lego replica, and him wearing the jacket as shown with the 26th of December 2014 incident. He also purchased a school desk, which he uses as a workstation, allowing him to further transition back to his happiest years. For many years, he fixated on the idea of a high school reunion, but his numerous attempts at trying to hold one failed miserably. Likely for the best, as the Manchester High School of his real life can't possibly compare with the one in his mind. Like many people who overindulge in nostalgia, Chris has a rather warped view of his time at Manchester High in retrospect. He often looks back on it as a time when he was surrounded by friends and could have easily obtained the true love he seeks to this day. If only he had known how good he had it. In reality, his more down-to-earth recollections of high school paint a picture of Chris being bullied, fairly isolated, and disengaged, with even his friends only really sticking around because the educational setting required them to be so. Now, here's the thing. You probably might be saying to yourselves at this point that, well, that's kind of it. But there is, like, another side to all of this as well. And it would be... I could consider the thought that... What about nostalgia in the present? You may remember that throughout a large periods of 2019, Chris would go on about how My Little Pony Gen 5 or Go Pony was not going to be a thing, and how My Little Pony was going to have 5 more seasons and would finish at the end of season 14. One thing you're going to but then again, the perception about whether or not this is because Chris legitimately enjoyed My Little Pony Friendship is Magic actually remains a pretty good question, because how many times can you honestly say on the back of your mind you've ever heard Chris talk about any real given episode of Friendship is Magic? And why Chris doesn't... the reason why Chris doesn't want it to end, it's a very... childish sort of level of wish fulfillment, because Chris thinks that this is just a period of life that is coming to an end, that Chris doesn't have any... But this is also like a huge issue we have to address with Chris, is that Chris is sadly under the impression that he can have the final say when it comes to movie. Like, Chris is, again, under the impression that life doesn't move on, he moves on, and rather Chris is the one to decide that this is the moment where he gets to move on. Well, and here's the great irony behind statements like that, is that it is certainly true that, you know, people adapt, evolve, mature, they transition out of things and they transition into things over the course of time. Unfortunately for Chris, time doesn't stop, or time is not convenient just because that's what Chris wants, if that makes sense. And unfortunately, Chris might wake up one day and realize that, guess what? In the words of the famous song, before you know it, 10 years have got behind you and you missed the starting gun. Now, whether or not... and this is sadly one of those cases where, again... This is not the sort of thing that is just lost on Chris. It's the sort of thing that is lost on hundreds of thousands of people. And we're not talking about people as infamous as Chris. We're talking about people who just go through life, just in a very general sort of way, like you and me. Yes, there are periods of our life that are certainly better than others. Certainly there are things that we remember fondly. No doubt there were also quite a lot of things that we look back on with anger and discourse and regret. But the problem we have, guys, is that, guess what? The way that Chris, you know how Chris honestly looks at nostalgia? Chris looks upon nostalgia as not as a part of his life, but as a part of a life sentence. As though it's the only thing that Chris technically has of his own, and the only thing that Chris will ever have. Because, well, Chris has not escaped from the rather large shadow of not just the better times, but also the times he lives to regret. Now, with that being said, this is also not necessarily one of those things where you necessarily have to feel bad for Chris. There's a lot of people who'll be saying that, well, the last thing you should be is feeling bad for Chris, and we will get to why next week. However, it's a very interesting... I find it, honestly, this sort of thing fascinating because, well, is it because Chris is so grossly unhappy the way things have turned out? Or is Chris more concerned about actually staying the way he is, or for everything to stay the way it is? They spoke earlier about, Chris actually having to, go outside and actually have to mingle in some form of society. A lot of people can be sort of apathetic about the whole affair because, well, there are people, not only are there people who just don't like school, there are also plenty of people who don't look kindly on their experiences in education. But that's a story for another day, possibly on another channel as well. So I hope all of you guys enjoyed Chris and Nostalgia, and I can't wait to see all of you guys again in the next video. So take care, and bye-bye for now. And also, finally, actually, you know what? In the words of the grossly underrated song, it's the only thing we have to look forward to, the past.